The sun was barely rising over the jagged ridges of the canyon, casting long shadows across the red rock formations, when Jake, a weathered rancher with calloused hands and a lifetime of stories etched into his face, found himself in a situation that would test every ounce of courage and instinct he had. He had been tracking a herd of wild horses for weeks, stubborn, untamed, breathtaking creatures that roamed freely across the highlands. But on this morning, what began as a routine trek turned into a nightmare he could never have imagined. Jake had always been drawn to wild horses. Ever since he was a boy, he remembered sneaking out to the fields behind his grandfather's ranch, hoping for a glimpse of the mysterious creatures that seemed almost magical in their freedom. But the years had hardened him. Life on the ranch had taught him caution, patience, and respect for nature's unpredictable power. Still, nothing could have prepared him for what awaited that morning. As he navigated the narrow canyon trails, the ground beneath his feet crumbled in places, sending small rocks clattering down into the depths below. The wind picked up, whipping his jacket and tangling his hair across his face. He had come here to rescue, or perhaps just observe, a particular stallion, a jet-black beauty with eyes so sharp and intelligent they seemed to pierce right through a person's soul. Locals had dubbed the horse Shadow, for his near-mythical ability to disappear into the landscape without a trace. Suddenly, a misstep, a loose rock giving way beneath his boot, sent Jake tumbling into a narrow crevice. The fall wasn't long, but the impact twisted his ankle painfully, leaving him wedged between two massive boulders. Pain shot through his leg, but worse than the physical agony was the stark realization of his isolation. Cell signal. Gone. No one would know he was here until evening, maybe later. Panic started creeping in, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your mind race. Then, above the echoing winds, came a sound that made his heart skip, the distant, powerful thundering of hooves. At first, Jake thought it was one of the herd moving along the canyon rim, a usual sight that he had seen hundreds of times. But there was something different, something almost deliberate in the rhythm, a pattern that suggested intention, as though the horse knew exactly where he was. Minutes felt like hours. Shadows deepened, and just when despair threatened to consume him, a massive shape emerged from the canyon's far edge. It was Shadow, the stallion, muscles rippling, mane flying like a dark flame against the morning light. The horse's eyes were locked on Jake, nostrils flaring as if he could sense the fear, the pain, the helplessness radiating from the trapped man. At first, Jake's instinct was to wave his arms, shout for help, plead. But he remembered every lesson he had ever learned about wild horses. They are not tamed by panic or force. They respond to presence, calmness, and courage, even in the face of chaos. So he took a deep, trembling breath and simply sat still, letting the stallion approach on its own terms. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of hooves striking rock, and for a moment, Jake felt as if time itself had stopped. Shadow circled the crevice, sniffing, pawing, and letting out a low, resonant whinny that carried both curiosity and warning. Jake could see the intelligence in those eyes, not just animal instinct, but something deeper, almost human in its awareness. He thought of his daughter, Mia, who had grown up with horses on their family ranch. She would have told him, "Dad, they can sense everything you feel. Don't fake it. Don't fight it." He hadn't realized it, but Mia's words now felt like a lifeline. He focused, not on the pain, not on the fear, but on being present, on letting the horse understand that he was not a threat, that he needed help. And then, it happened. Shadow shifted his weight, backing up slightly, then nudged a loose boulder near the edge of the crevice with a hoof. The rock rolled, hitting the ground with a thud. It was subtle, but Jake understood. The stallion was testing the terrain, assessing whether he could move closer, whether he could help in some way. Jake's heart raced with awe. Could a horse, untamed and wild, really understand the peril of a human trapped in this canyon? The morning grew hotter, and Jake's situation became more precarious. Sweat dripped from his brow, and he winced with every attempt to adjust his position. But with every careful step, Shadow mirrored his movements, keeping a careful distance while showing signs of protective awareness. For the first time in years, Jake felt a raw connection with a creature that was utterly free yet capable of empathy beyond expectation. Suddenly, a sharp crack reverberated through the canyon, the sound of shifting rock, unstable terrain threatening to collapse further. Jake's heart lurched. He called out instinctively, his voice trembling, "Shadow! You have to help me." It was foolish. He knew the horse couldn't understand words, but maybe, just maybe, it could feel urgency, danger, the pulse of life trembling nearby. The stallion's ears pinned back, and in a fluid motion that seemed almost choreographed, he bolted down the slope with breathtaking speed. Dust and pebbles scattered in his wake. Jake could barely comprehend what he was seeing. For a wild horse to come this close to the edge, risking slipping on loose rocks. Only one explanation came to mind. Shadow was intent on helping him. As the stallion arrived at the crevice, he pawed the earth, nudging loose stones toward Jake in a strange, deliberate pattern. Jake realized that the horse might be trying to create leverage, a small platform for him to climb out, or at least make the space more navigable. He marveled at the stallion's raw intelligence and, more importantly, his trust. A connection had been forged in seconds that might otherwise have taken years of training. And there it was, the first real glimmer of hope. Jake's breathing slowed, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. He knew he wasn't alone. Not really. Not as long as Shadow remained by his side, navigating the canyon with him in a silent partnership built on trust, courage, and something unspoken yet profound. The morning's ordeal was only beginning. Challenges still lay ahead, treacherous ledges, unstable rock formations, and Jake's own weakened body. But for the first time, he felt a surge of determination. He had a lifeline, a wild creature who had defied expectation, and together, they would face the canyon's peril. Cut to cinematic close-up of the stallion's eye, sunlight reflecting, intense focus. "Stick with me," Jake whispered, almost to himself. "We're getting out of this, together." The canyon was a maze of jagged cliffs, narrow ledges, and shadows that shifted with every flicker of sunlight. Jake's ankle throbbed with every attempt to move, and the realization that he couldn't climb out alone weighed heavily on him. But he wasn't alone. Shadow lingered just below the ledge where Jake was trapped, eyes darting with vigilance, muscles taut and ready. There was no hesitation in the stallion's stance, no question about what he was doing. He was focused, aware, and strangely determined to help. Jake tried to make himself comfortable against the canyon wall, but comfort was impossible. His body screamed in protest, and the dust from the canyon floor clung to his sweat-soaked clothes. Still, every time he looked at Shadow, something inside him shifted. He realized that he had never felt so seen, or so understood, by any living being. In the wild, a horse survives through instinct, alertness, and intelligence. But this stallion's behavior went beyond survival. There was awareness here, almost human in its depth. As Jake pondered the surreal situation, a loose scree beneath him gave way with a sharp clatter. His heart leapt, and he froze. Rocks slid dangerously close, and for a moment, he thought he might tumble further into the canyon. But before fear could paralyze him, Shadow reacted. The stallion snorted sharply, pawing at the edge as if to warn Jake, then bolted along the narrow ledge above him, kicking up dust and small stones. It was an instinctive, protective motion, a warning that danger was near, and Jake understood. He had an ally here, a guardian of flesh and bone that no human could replicate. Minutes passed like hours as Jake formulated a plan. He could try to shimmy along the ledge, using rocks for support, but his injured ankle made every movement precarious. Panic nipped at him, but he remembered something he had learned in his youth. Animals, especially horses, respond to calm, deliberate energy. If he panicked, Shadow might retreat, leaving him stranded. He took a slow, controlled breath, feeling the raw energy of the stallion pulsating through the canyon air. Somehow, he knew they were connected, not just by proximity, but by an unspoken bond forged in necessity and mutual respect. Then, Jake noticed it, a small natural ramp formed by rocks near the canyon floor. Alone, he couldn't reach it. But maybe Shadow could. The stallion had been moving in measured circles, testing distances, assessing Jake's situation with astonishing accuracy. Without a second thought, Jake whispered encouragements, even though he knew the horse couldn't understand his words. "You can do it. I trust you." With a sudden surge of energy, Shadow launched himself down the canyon, negotiating rocks with balletic precision. He reached the ramp and began nudging stones toward Jake, creating a makeshift platform. Each movement was deliberate, intelligent, and astonishingly coordinated. Jake felt or wash over him. A wild stallion, untamed and fierce, was actively participating in a rescue. It was a moment of wonder that surpassed fear, a reminder of nature's unpredictability and brilliance. The wind picked up again, carrying a faint scent of pine and dust, and Jake realized how vulnerable he truly was. The canyon could have swallowed him whole in an instant. But Shadow remained, a sentinel of muscle and instinct, circling to protect him. Jake tried to stretch his leg, testing the platform the stallion had formed. Every inch was agonizing, but progress was possible. He whispered again, this time more firmly, "Come on, boy, we've got this." Then, a sudden rumble shook the canyon walls. Loose rocks fell from above, narrowly missing Jake's head. Fear gripped him, but Shadow reacted instantly, pawing the ground, ears pinned, eyes wide. The stallion's awareness was almost preternatural. He could sense danger before it became visible. With a powerful snort, he nudged Jake forward, guiding him toward the safest path. For the first time, Jake felt that the horse wasn't just helping. He was leading, directing with confidence and precision. As Jake carefully made his way along the precarious ledge, he thought back to his childhood, to lessons about trust and patience. His father had always said, "Nature will give you a chance to survive if you respect it." He had learned that over decades on the ranch, but now he realized how literal that lesson was. Survival wasn't just about strength or cunning, it was about connection. And in this canyon, connection came in the form of Shadow, a wild stallion whose loyalty and intelligence defied every expectation. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Jake had lost track. His ankle throbbed, his arms ached, but the thought of giving up never crossed his mind. Each time he faltered, Shadow was there, nudging, guiding, and somehow providing both physical and emotional support. It was an extraordinary demonstration of empathy in a creature that humans often underestimated. For every stumble, there was a hoof to steady, a presence that reminded him he wasn't alone. Then, just as exhaustion threatened to take over, the canyon narrowed into a small alcove bathed in sunlight. It wasn't escape yet, but it was a safe spot, a chance to rest and plan the next move. Jake sank to the ground, panting, sweat and dust streaked across his face. Shadow stood beside him, muzzle close, exhaling warm breath that smelled of earth and wildness. Jake reached out, almost instinctively, and ran his fingers along the stallion's maneir. For a moment, the canyon disappeared, leaving just the connection between man and horse, two beings relying on one another in a world that had suddenly become fragile and dangerous. In that quiet moment, Jake's thoughts wandered to his family, his ranch, and the life he had led. He realized that he had spent decades trying to tame the world around him. Horses, land, circumstances. But here, survival depended not on domination, but on partnership. Shadow embodied that lesson perfectly. Raw power tempered by intelligence, freedom balanced with responsibility. But their trials weren't over. The canyon ahead narrowed even further, cliffs looming higher, and Jake knew that the next step would test not just his physical strength, but the trust between him and the stallion. Could a wild horse truly guide a human out of a treacherous canyon? Could he rely on instinct, empathy, and intelligence in a situation that defied logic? He didn't know, but looking into Shadow's eyes, he felt a glimmer of hope. And just as he was about to plan his next move, a new sound reached him, the faint but unmistakable echo of human voices in the distance. Searchers. Perhaps they were fellow ranchers, maybe even authorities. The canyon's acoustics distorted the sound, making it hard to pinpoint direction, but the knowledge that help might be nearby added both hope and urgency. Shadow's ears twitched, his body tense, but he didn't panic. He seemed to sense that the solution wasn't rushing blindly. It was precision, patience, and courage, the same qualities Jake would need to follow him safely. The stage was set for the next chapter of their ordeal, a dance of instinct and intellect between man and horse, a journey where every step could be life or death. Jake tightened his grip on the rocks, glancing at Shadow, and whispered, almost reverently, "Lead the way. I'm right behind you." The canyon seemed to tighten around them, cliffs pressing in like the walls of a giant, ancient fortress. Jake's muscles screamed with every step, his injured ankle throbbing violently, but he knew there was no turning back. Behind him, the faint echo of voices from the search party still drifted through the canyon, mingling with the wind. Ahead, Shadow moved with uncanny precision, every step deliberate, every glance assessing the terrain. The alcove they had reached offered only a brief respite. Beyond it, the canyon floor dropped sharply, the rocks slick with dust and loose gravel. One wrong move could send Jake plummeting into the abyss. He swallowed hard, sweat stinging his eyes, and focused on the stallion. Shadow's muscles rippled under his sleek black coat, his breath coming in controlled snorts. It was as if he knew the canyon's every secret, every precarious ledge and hidden danger. Jake had never seen a horse so acutely aware, so in tune with the world around him. He realized something profound. Shadow wasn't just helping him survive. He was teaching him to survive, guiding him with instinct and intelligence that no map, no rope, no human guide could match. The stallion turned briefly, eyes locking with Jake's, and in that gaze was a silent command. Follow. Trust me. You're not alone. Every movement forward was painstaking. Jake used his hands to steady himself on jagged rocks, each motion sending sharp jolts of pain through his leg. But Shadow stayed close, circling beneath ledges, testing rocks with his hooves, nudging loose stones into more stable positions. The stallion seemed to anticipate every challenge before it appeared, moving as though he had already mapped a safe path through the canyon in his mind. Then came the first real test. A narrow gap opened before them, a jagged split in the canyon wall barely wide enough for a man. Jake froze. The thought of trying to squeeze through with his ankle twisted, the dust and loose stones underfoot, sent a wave of fear crashing over him. But Shadow didn't hesitate. The stallion stepped forward, hooves clattering against rock, then paused, looking back at Jake. His eyes were almost human in their focus, a mixture of concern and reassurance. Jake exhaled, summoning courage he didn't know he had left. He inched forward, one hand gripping rock, one foot carefully testing each ledge. Shadow followed, close enough to touch if needed, his presence a lifeline of strength and instinct. Every crevice and loose stone seemed to whisper danger, yet Jake felt an unshakable confidence in the stallion. It was a trust forged in desperation and awe, an unspoken bond stronger than fear itself. Midway through the gap, disaster nearly struck. A loose rock shifted beneath Jake's hand. He yelped as his balance faltered, the canyon's abyss yawning below him. Instinctively, Shadow reacted. The stallion reared slightly, hooves thudding against the rock wall, and nudged Jake's elbow with his muzzle, redirecting his center of gravity just enough to prevent a fall. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He sank to the ground, chest heaving, and whispered, "You saved me." The stallion whinnied softly, a low sound that echoed through the canyon. It wasn't just a horse reacting, it was Shadow acknowledging him, acknowledging the bond that had grown in these harrowing hours. Jake realized in that moment that this wasn't just a rescue. It was a partnership, a connection that transcended words. As they pushed forward, the canyon threw another challenge at them. A sudden landslide of smaller rocks tumbled from above, narrowly missing Jake's shoulder. The noise was deafening, the dust blinding, but Shadow remained steadfast, snorting and stamping, creating a barrier between Jake and the cascading debris. It was astonishing. The stallion's intelligence and courage weren't instinct alone, they were deliberate choices, acts of empathy and protection that defied expectation. In the midst of chaos, Jake's mind drifted back to his past, to the struggles that had defined him. Years of harsh winters on the ranch, of losses he had endured quietly, of battles with pride and stubbornness, it all converged in this moment. He realized that survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological. The canyon demanded courage, resilience, and trust in forces beyond one's control. And in that, he found clarity. He wasn't just relying on Shadow. He was learning from him. Hours, or maybe minutes, time had blurred. Later, they reached a precarious ledge that jutted out over the canyon floor. The ledge was narrow, barely a foot wide in places, and the drop was dizzying. Jake's hands shook as he gripped rock, sweat stinging his eyes. He could hear the wind whistling through the canyon, carrying an almost musical resonance. Shadow approached carefully, testing the ledge with hooves, then stepped onto it with the ease of a mountain goat. His balance was perfect, his body fluid and controlled. Jake swallowed hard, then followed, one careful step at a time. The stallion moved with him, guiding subtly, never forcing, but always present. Each step was a negotiation between human frailty and equine precision. Every nerve in Jake's body screamed with tension, but the presence of Shadow transformed fear into determination. Suddenly, a twist in the canyon revealed a hidden crevice filled with water, a small stream glimmering in the sunlight. Relief surged through Jake. They had found an oasis, a brief moment of safety, a chance to rest, rehydrate, and prepare for the final stretch. He sank to the ground beside the stream, letting the cool water wash over his dusty hands, while Shadow drank with a measured patience, never letting his guard down. As he watched the stallion, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the magnitude of what had happened. A wild horse, untamed, unpredictable, had become his guide, protector, and companion. In the chaos of the canyon, he had discovered a truth he had long forgotten. Trust and empathy are more powerful than brute strength. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and unwavering, like the gaze of a horse that refuses to abandon you. But the canyon had one final test. Ahead, a cliff rose sharply, its surface smooth and slick from years of wind erosion. There was no natural path, no ledge to climb. Jake's heart sank. Could Shadow guide him through this? Could a horse, no matter how intelligent, navigate a challenge that even seasoned humans might find impossible? He looked into the stallion's eyes, and in them, he found the answer. Shadow stepped forward, ears pinned slightly, muscles coiled, every movement precise. It wasn't just instinct, it was intention. The stallion had led Jake through every peril, calculated every risk, and now, at the canyon's final hurdle, he was ready to show that their bond could conquer the impossible. Jake took a deep, shuddering breath and whispered, "All right, one more step. Together." Cut to cinematic slow motion, the stallion leading Jake toward the cliff face, the sun casting golden light over the canyon, dust and determination filling the frame. Every heartbeat echoed in the canyon, every step a testament to survival, trust, and the extraordinary connection between man and horse. The end was near, but danger still lingered, and the story wasn't over yet. The cliff loomed ahead like a wall of stone, slick with dust and erosion, seemingly impossible to scale. Jake's ankles screamed with every movement, and the canyon's shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, mocking his efforts. But Shadow didn't hesitate. The stallion's dark eyes were sharp, focused, and unyielding. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to move with precision and purpose. He had brought Jake this far, and now there was no turning back. Jake steadied himself, gripping the rock with hands raw and scraped from hours of climbing. Sweat and dirt streaked his face, his chest heaving with exhaustion and adrenaline. He glanced at the stallion, searching for guidance. And there it was, the unspoken command, the quiet insistence that they could do this. Shadow's ears twitched, and he stepped forward, testing the base of the cliff, then shifted slightly, as if showing the safest approach. The climb began. Every step was a delicate negotiation between the canyon's treacherous surface and Jake's injured body. Loose stones threatened to betray him at every turn. Dust filled his lungs, and the wind tugged at his jacket like a living force determined to push him back. But Shadow stayed close, pouring rocks, nudging debris out of the way, circling below Jake with a protective vigilance that left him awestruck. At one particularly narrow ledge, Jake misjudged his footing, and for a terrifying moment, he slipped. His heart leapt into his throat as he grasped at air, rocks skittering beneath his hands. It was almost too late, until a powerful presence struck beneath him. Shadow reared, kicking the canyon wall with force and instinctively positioning himself to block further descent. The stallion's chest pressed against Jake's legs, steadying him just enough to regain his balance. Jake's hands shook as he clung to the cliff, and for the first time in his life, he openly wept, not just from fear, but from gratitude, awe, and disbelief. "You saved me," he whispered, voice trembling, tears cutting streaks through the dirt on his face. Shadow lowered his head, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning every angle of the canyon as though to say, "We're not done yet. Stay with me." The hours of struggle had worn Jake to his limits, but he had learned something vital. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was action in the presence of fear. And now, every ounce of courage was being tested. He pushed forward, guided by the stallion's movements, until they reached a narrow crevice that formed a natural staircase of rock protrusions. Each step required precision, every handhold and foothold carefully chosen. One mistake would mean disaster. And then came the twist. A loose rock, larger than the others, shifted beneath Jake's weight, threatening to plunge him down the cliff. Panic gripped him, but before he could react, Shadow lunged with calculated force, knocking the rock aside with his hooves and sending it clattering harmlessly down the canyon floor. Jake froze in shock and awe. This was no longer just instinct, this was deliberate action. A wild stallion, untamed and unpredictable, had saved a human life not once, but twice, relying on intellect, empathy, and trust built in mere hours. Jake continued, inch by inch, with Shadow as both guide and protector. Dust swirled around them, sunlight slicing through the canyon's jagged walls, highlighting the raw intensity of the moment. Sweat stung Jake's eyes, his muscles burned, and yet, he pressed forward. Every glance at Shadow reminded him of the extraordinary connection they shared, the silent communication that had become their lifeline. Finally, they reached a ledge high above the canyon floor, a plateau of sun-warmed rock that offered safety, at least temporarily. Jake sank to the ground, chest heaving, sweat and tears mingling. Shadow stood beside him, nostrils flaring, mane blowing in the wind, muscles still taut and alert. The stallion's presence was calming yet powerful, a reminder of the wild and untamed world that Jake had only glimpsed until now. For a few moments, they rested, the canyon silent except for the rush of wind and distant bird calls. Jake's mind replayed every moment, the fall into the crevice, the landslides, the narrow ledges, the cliff, and the stallion's near-miraculous interventions. He realized that what had begun as a terrifying ordeal had become a lesson in trust, empathy, and courage. He had survived not by his own strength alone, but through connection, with nature, with instinct, and most profoundly, with a creature that had defied every expectation. But their story wasn't over. From the canyon's rim, faint voices could now be heard more clearly, searchers who had been combing the area for hours. Relief surged through Jake, but he knew they couldn't just wait to be found. The path ahead required careful navigation, and there was one last challenge, the canyon's final slope, steep and treacherous, that would lead them to open terrain. Jake rose slowly, testing his ankle, and glanced at Shadow. The stallion whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry encouragement. They were partners now, bound by trust, desperation, and an unspoken understanding that only moments like these could forge. Jake nodded to him, silently saying, "Let's finish this. Together." Step by step, they descended the final slope. Loose rocks tumbled beneath Jake's feet, but Shadow moved with remarkable foresight, positioning himself to offer guidance and protection. At one point, Jake stumbled, and the stallion nudged him gently with his muzzle, helping him regain balance. It was a moment of quiet heroism that left Jake in awe, not of the horse's strength, but of his intelligence and empathy. And then, finally, the canyon opened. Sunlight flooded the landscape, washing over the jagged rocks and illuminating the valley beyond. Jake's heart soared. Relief, gratitude, and disbelief collided within him. He had survived the impossible, guided and protected by a wild stallion whose actions seemed almost supernatural in their precision. He turned to Shadow, wanting to speak, to convey the depth of his gratitude, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he reached out, running his hands along the stallion's glossy coat, feeling the warmth and strength beneath his fingers. In that instant, Jake knew their bond was unbreakable, a connection forged in fear, tested by adversity, and solidified through mutual trust and courage. Cut to cinematic wide shot. Jake and the stallion standing at the canyon's edge, sunlight highlighting their silhouettes, the vast open landscape before them. And as the distant voices of the searchers grew nearer, Jake realized something profound. He had not only survived, but he had witnessed the extraordinary, the power of trust, the brilliance of instinct, and the kind of heroism that comes not from human hands, but from the heart of a wild, untamed creature. The canyon ordeal was over. The terror, the danger, the uncertainty, all behind them. Ahead lay safety, relief, and the first glimpse of the life-saving reunion that awaited. But the emotional journey, the awe-inspiring bond between human and horse, would remain with Jake forever. Sunlight poured over the canyon rim, illuminating the valley beyond in a golden glow that made the dust and rocks sparkle like scattered jewels. Jake took a deep, shuddering breath, the tension of the last hours beginning to dissolve. His ankle throbbed, his body ached, but he was alive. And beside him stood Shadow, the wild stallion, still vigilant, mane blowing in the breeze, eyes gleaming with intelligence and quiet pride. The voices of the searchers grew louder, human figures appearing on the canyon rim. Relief surged through Jake. He had survived the impossible, but it wasn't just survival that left him in awe, it was the extraordinary bond he had forged with a creature who had risked everything to save him. As he waved to the rescuers, Shadow remained close, cautious yet calm, as if assessing every human movement before allowing himself to relax. Jake's gratitude ran deeper than words. He had always admired wild horses from a distance, but now he understood the depth of their intelligence, their empathy, and their astonishing capacity for connection. One of the rescuers, a ranger named Lewis, called down to him, his voice carrying both concern and relief. "Jake, are you okay? We saw the dust and rocks. We thought we might be too late." Jake smiled weakly, brushing dust from his clothes, and replied, "I'm fine, thanks to him." He gestured toward Shadow, who regarded the humans cautiously but with a calm composure that suggested trust had been earned. The rescuers approached slowly, respecting the stallion's presence, there or evident. One whispered, "I've never seen a horse do anything like this." Jake nodded. "Neither have I. He saved me. More than once. I don't know how, but he understood what to do. He was my guide." Shadow lifted his head, letting out a low, proud whinny, and Jake felt a swell of emotion in his chest. Tears blurred his vision, but this time they were of gratitude and awe, not fear. He had survived the canyon not just because of human skill, but because of the courage, intelligence, and trust of a wild horse. As the rescuers helped him to safety, Jake stayed close to Shadow, hand resting on the stallion's neck. The canyon's dangers were behind them, but the memory of every step, the slip, the landslides, the narrow ledges, and the near-impossible cliff climb, would remain with him forever. The sun rose higher, bathing the landscape in light. Jake looked back at the canyon, at the rocks and shadows that had nearly claimed him. And then he looked at Shadow, whose dark coat gleamed, eyes reflecting both wild freedom and profound loyalty. He realized something he hadn't in years. Courage and trust are not just human traits. They live in every creature that respects life and connection. One of the rescuers asked, "What do we do with him?" referring to the stallion. Jake paused, looking into Shadow's intelligent eyes, and smiled. "Let him be free," he said. "He belongs out here. But I'll never forget him, or what he's done." And with that, Shadow lifted his head, ears alert, and with a single powerful leap, vanished back into the open canyon, a silhouette of black against the glowing landscape. Jake watched him go, a sense of wonder and awe filling his chest. This wasn't just a story of survival, it was a story of trust, courage, and an extraordinary bond between human and horse that would remain forever in his memory. As Jake turned to walk with the rescuers, his thoughts drifted to his family, his ranch, and all the times he had underestimated the power of connection with the animals he had devoted his life to. He knew now that survival and heroism could come from unexpected places, from a being who refused to abandon him, who acted with intelligence, empathy, and courage beyond instinct. Later, back at his ranch, Jake shared the story with his daughter Mia, who listened in awe. "Dad, he saved you," she whispered, eyes wide. Jake nodded. "Yes, Mia. He did. And I learned something today. Sometimes the greatest heroes aren't humans at all. Sometimes they're the ones we least expect, the ones who teach us about trust and courage without a single word." The story of Shadow and the canyon rescue spread quickly. Locals, horse lovers, and adventurers alike marveled at the tale of a wild stallion whose bravery and intelligence had saved a life. And while Jake never tried to capture Shadow, he visited the canyon often, knowing that the stallion was out there, untamed, proud, and free, a reminder of the extraordinary bond between humans and horses. Cut to cinematic montage. Sweeping shots of Shadow running through the canyon, Jake watching from a distance, sunlight glinting off rocks, wind rustling through mane and trees. Jake often reflected on that day, on the fear, the trust, and the quiet heroism that had carried him through. He realized that life's greatest lessons often arrive in moments of danger, and the bonds we form, whether human or animal, can define us in ways nothing else can. And though the canyon remained wild, rugged, and unforgiving, Jake walked its edges with a newfound respect for nature, a deeper understanding of courage, and a heart full of gratitude for a wild stallion who had done the impossible. For those watching this story, remember, courage is not always loud, trust is not always easy, and heroes can come in all shapes and sizes, even in the form of a wild horse whose loyalty, intelligence, and bravery can leave you in awe.